morning. My name is Bree Houston, and I'll be your presenter. So we are now recording, so just repeating that for everyone. And today's topic is really our O365 and InfoPath kind of working together, workarounds, and how to quickly kind of optimize your data to make your forms more data-driven and your process more data-driven. So taking it out of your users' hands. And I have Rima, who's a new person at Qdabra, helping out today. So she'll be kind of monitoring the chat window and doing our recording for us this morning. Okay, so without further ado, our Office 365. So there's this big kind of buzz and hubbub about moving to the cloud and what that means. But it's really just saying that we're taking our data from living maybe in an on-prem environment, which could be, kind of spendy or, take up lots of space. You have to have that environment set up, and moving it to somewhere that's managed kind of free of our own hands, and we don't really have to worry about it. So that's kind of the nice feature of the cloud, as well as kind of the integration with all of the other Office products you may have noticed already. And you may notice a few different items, differing environments from kind of your maybe on-prem environment in 2010 or 2013 to the cloud. And that's really where I want to start today. So kind of an overview. So the key features for successful forms and cloud settings in InfoPath form services, and what those differences are from 2013 and 2010, which I'm sure some people are very familiar with. And really the biggest thing is that everything's going to be located in the cloud. There's some Office improvements, some differing UI, but that's essentially the big kind of nugget between 365 in the cloud and 2013 and 2010. And also your InfoPath form services is kind of grouped together with Excel services as a collection property that you can enable on your site. Another kind of piece of 365 in the cloud is that there's no central admin. So some people might be used to kind of that back-end management of things like your user profiles and other kind of settings that affect your entire farm. Now that's something that you manage actually from the front end if you're an admin in the new Office 365 Admin Center. And this is where your user profile data is just a little bit different, but it's still, about the same and easy to navigate to once you know it's there. And then leveraging workflows to optimize your process, I think has gotten even easier kind of with that integration with user profile data kind of accessible from the front end. So getting to your profiles, it's really, if you have this admin tab available on your SharePoint site, it's as easy as selecting your SharePoint, navigating to your user profiles, and here we are at kind of under the people, manage user properties, which allows you to add custom properties and also manage your user profile. So why would you want to add custom properties to your user profiles? Well, these can be hugely beneficial if you have maybe a unique property in your organization, something that is maybe a sub-department. You can add those features and values that then can be leveraged in not only your InfoPath forms and forms-based workflows, but SharePoint workflows as well. So hugely powerful, and the sky is really the limit as far as what you want to do. However, there's kind of one precautionary with that, and it is if you're a larger organization and you're adding these custom properties, it's going to require you to manually edit those properties in each profile as the person's added. So that's just one thing to keep in mind if that's kind of the method that you're going. Another great option, and you may have noticed this from other workflows that you have in process, SharePoint lists can be a really great tool for kind of consolidating some data for particular workflows and forms in one location by kind of using that username value to kind of drive the query of information. So using the user profile service, you may have seen a webinar that we did back in October of, I believe it was 20 13, so 10/10/2013 on the site, and I've included the link here, which you'll receive the slides and also the demos at the end if you fill out our survey, so that's another great reason to do that. But that webinar essentially goes over what the difference is with all of these data connections using the user profile service. And as of recently, I've actually discovered that in 365 it's not required for your data connection to be converted to a UDCX. Now, if you are on a subsite, you're going to have to probably still do that if you cannot connect through that subsite, and that's kind of through the network of your user profile on your SharePoint site. And if you do have to go through that process, this webinar is a great kind of tool for setting up that particular data connection. But now essentially, and this was kind of the big takeaway from that webinar, you can use a form load rule to set the query value to the username and retrieve that information from your user profile service, which was a little bit different than if you were on-prem or if you are using filler versus browser. So this would be the browser method. The filler method would still be to automatically retrieve data every time the form loads, which we typically recommend as not a great setting, but you'll have to do that if you're using the filler. Now in the browser, if you do that, and I'll show this in just a minute, the query will actually not run. The web service will reject the query, and we won't get our data. So just a few things to keep in mind as you look at your various environments. Okay, so why use the user profile service? And this really pertains to when you have lots and lots of data coming in and out of your forms. If you want to do reporting, a few things become really important. So auto-populating data is going to be vital to that process, and that's not only because it's going to retrieve the latest data, it's going to automate that process, it's going to eliminate kind of missteps because of incorrect data entry, which can be a huge piece in a workflow not firing correctly. Say a user types an incorrect email address or an email address that doesn't actually belong to a person, that workflow will not run as intended. So if we have that email brought into our form automatically, there's kind of a fail-safe for the user not being able to incorrectly enter that data. So now I'm going to jump into the demo part of this. So I'm going to start in kind of that user profile and properties like we kind of know and love. Then I'm going to go to the form itself, and I have a quick demo to show kind of the difference between query every time the form is loaded and then querying on a form load or after the form is loaded. So that would be kind of the filler versus the browser. And then I'm going to show kind of an expense report that's using that particular workflow process and how we can integrate that with a SharePoint workflow, so a simple email workflow, and I'll also show that in SharePoint Designer. All right, so I'm just going to minimize this here, and like I said, I'm going to bring over my 365 site, and you can see SharePoint is always working on it, and I'm just going to open this. So you can see here from my SharePoint site, I have my admin tab here. And I have my Office 365 settings, which are going to be site settings across all of your farms. And then I also have my SharePoint settings. So I'm going to navigate to my SharePoint settings. And you can really see how easy it is to navigate to those user profiles. And it just takes a moment to load. So this kind of UI is very familiar. We can manage user properties. So this is going to be where if you want to add or change any of the actual properties that are used in your form, you can create a new property. You can change the property type. I do say proceed with this with caution. A lot of the out-of-the-box values are just fine for what you need to do in your forms. And then if we go back, we can see we can manage our user profiles. And I'm just going to search for myself here. And I can go in and edit that profile. And you can see that once you get a lot of this set up, it's going to kind of streamline that process. Much of this is created, such as the account name and the email, when you create the user's account, which are really the key pieces of data. But you can see that my manager is listed here, which we'll get to in a little bit, and how that's also useful in this workflow process, and also my work email. So both of those are kind of key pieces there. And then also kind of debugging some of these user things. A good place to start is kind of in your SharePoint settings and features that are available over your entire site. So if you're having issues, this is a good place to kind of dive in and start kind of figuring out which properties maybe are not enabled on your site. And that's going to take a while to load, so we're going to move on. And I'm going to go back to my site. And I'm actually going to pull up the sample form that I have for this demo. So I'm going to go to my data connections, and you can see my connection string here. So the connection string is your SharePoint site or pathway to your site and subsite using the VTI bin user profile service. So if I go ahead and modify that, hopefully I'll be able to modify this morning. And this brings up another kind of debugging tool. So if you're asked to log in and you get an access denied, one thing that you can do is to, like this, I'm getting an access denied. One thing you can do is actually download something from your SharePoint site, kind of forcing it to open an info path, and sometimes that'll open the pathway to be able to edit these particular data queries. But the method that we're using is get user profile by name. And you can see on this one I have the data to retrieve every time the form is opened. So this is kind of the situation where you would want if you have the filler enabled. And then our secondary is actually with a form load query. And so it's not set to query every time the form is open. So if I look at that form load rule, I have a get user and the account name and query. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at that. So if I set another kind of trick here, set my form to full trust just for preview, it's going to allow me to preview this data without having to go out to my site and download. And just logging in here, the multiple credential prompts. And just a few minutes as my data connection loads. And you can see I get some errors, but here we have the auto lookup. So my set user there, I can set my username. And this is for the browser option, but you can see I have the auto lookup. So this is every time the form is open, and it's loading my user data, which is just what we want in this filler scenario. Now if we go out to our 365 site, I'm going to open the user test again, and we're going to see something different. So this is going to be the query after the form load rules. We're going to see one error, and that's because the other function is still trying to query every time the form is opened, and that's okay because we know that's going to happen. And you can see the manual lookup, which is on our form load rules. Here I've set my account name, and now I'm querying for that user data. So if I set my user now, I'm getting the username, my full name, and email address. So that's really kind of the root of using the user profile service to retrieve those key pieces of data. Now I can set my full name in the form, I can set my email. And the way that we're doing that is with the various properties. So if we take a look at these rules here, and it's in my set other, we're using the value and name key. So if we look at our data source here, and we expand these data fields, we can see that we have a few nodes, and the ones that we're using are the value here. So that's the actual value returned by the name column here. So we can specify the various names that we want to use. Looks like InfoPath has restarted here, and that's okay. And now we're going to actually move into our second part of the demo. So this is actually going to be the expense report example where, and Rima, I might ask you, is everyone still hearing me okay? I just got a prompt about my audio.
Yeah, Bree, we can hear you. You're good.
Okay, thank you. All right, I will continue. So I have our expense report example set up here. And what I'm going to do is just click this new expense report. And again, this is the same error because we're attempting to load every time a form is opened, and that's okay. But we can see that if I go to our admin panel, I have some kind of debug set up here. And what I'm going to do is set query and values. So you can see I have the query auto option here and the query browser. So this would, the query filler option is going to be that automatic, and then the query unload is where we're going to set the query value. And you can see that I actually have retrieved all in one step my manager's username and then requeried that same data connection. So you'll be able to dive into that a little bit later. So we're going to go back to main, and you can see now I have my user information. So I have my name, my email address, my manager's name and email address, and I'm actually capturing my manager's username too. So why would I want to do that? Well, on submit, I'm going to fire off an action that notifies my manager that they need to come and approve this particular form. And in this situation, because I actually have it set up, I cannot go in and approve my own form. But with the workflow on the back end, it's going to notify my manager, and when they come back in, if it's the right person, it'll be enabled, which is generally how we want those to work. So we can see now my submit is disabled. I'm going to go ahead and close the form. And we can see that I have this column added for workflow. So I've promoted a few properties, my employee email, manager email, and the form status. So these are all properties that we want to utilize in that workflow. I'm going to refresh here. And what we should see is, yep, right there, stage 1. And sometimes this takes a few minutes for the email to actually generate. And you can see the internal status is completed. So that means my workflow is run. It's actually submitted that email. And now that it has been approved, you can see that my manager here was emailed with the same message, and I was also copied that my new request has been received and is ready for approval. So if we go into SharePoint Designer now, I want to show a little bit about how that workflow is functioning. So I have a very, very simple workflow, and this is something I wanted to show because we often have this from a lot of our customers, that they want this kind of automated email workflow. And it can be difficult if you've never used SharePoint Designer to kind of figure it out. So if we start from the workflows themselves, if I wanted to create a new workflow for that particular library, I tend to use this list workflow, and then you select that particular one and go in and edit. So I'm going to go back to my workflow that's running. You can see that my start options, I have start workflow automatically and when an item is changed. These are options that you want both to be checked if this is going to happen kind of throughout the process of your form filling experience. So I'm going to edit that workflow, and you can see I'm using some simple values. So if my current item from this library and my item's form status is equal to submitted, I want to email both of those other properties, so the manager email and copy the employee email. You can also use the current item created by, so that's another way that you can utilize that. And I'm also using an else step. So this is for maybe the notification for approval or rejection. I'm going to say if the current form status is equal to approved, go ahead and email the employee. Now if I wanted to add another else branch here, I can click, let's see if I can click in the right place, here, and I should get in one of these another else branch. Let's see. There we go. So I can click this else branch. It's going to add another else if, and so it's kind of constantly evaluating this. I can then add my condition if any value equals any value. So again, my current item and my form status, so again, these are promoted properties, is equal to rejected. I'm going to, again, email, and this is where I set my action and email those users. It's also important to note that every workflow needs a transition to the end of the workflow. So this is going to end the process and actually complete. So that's kind of the quick and dirty with the workflow. And if we go back to our SharePoint site now, there's a few methods for debugging as well. I've seen these workflows not fire with errors. And it's important to note that workflows need to be enabled from your site collection features. So if I look at these features, there's a few things to look at if your workflows are not functioning. So the first one is going to be if this workflows. So if you're using it out of the box and it's not active, it will not function. We have also our 3-state. We need our SharePoint Server Standard Site Collection features. So features such as the user profiles and search, so that's important to also have this function. And then there's one more, if I can find it here. On some sites, there's also sync all libraries and lists to allow, there we go. Oh no, it's not there. But essentially, it's a setting to allow your libraries and lists to send data out externally. So that's another great place to start for debugging. Okay, so kind of as a wrap-up, we talked about 365 forms and kind of optimizations and differences to improve your workflow process. And if you want those sample forms and a copy of this presentation, go ahead and take our survey. Everybody who responds is going to get the webinar package with all of those goodies included. So now I'd like to open the floor to any questions we may have from the audience. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it into that chat window and we can make sure to answer your question. And I'll give people a few minutes to type in there. Or chat, or you can even raise your hand and we can call on you and have you ask a question. I'll give folks just one more minute to type in. Oh, we got one. Okay. Okay, so how do you connect to repeating tables and sections in an InfoPath form? So essentially, that I believe has been covered in a separate webinar, but what you're going to want to do, especially if this is nested repeating. Oh, nested repeating. How do you connect to nested repeating? So that gets a little bit more complicated. Out of the box, it's not an easy function to do in order to send to various SharePoint lists. If you're trying to pull information from SharePoint lists into your form, it's going to require kind of a varying query of that data. So essentially, let's see if I can do a good job of explaining this. You're going to want to query the initial data source and then use a unique value to the secondary table that's linked to the first in order to set your second table. And then there's some more complex logic that goes on for kind of hiding and showing various items. So good question. That's probably a little bit more advanced than what we're talking about today. Any other questions from the audience? All right, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us in today's webinar. Again, if you want the goodies, go ahead and fill out the survey at the end, and we'll see you next webinar.